Deep beneath the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in climate-controlled archives where the air never feels too warm or too dry, there's a fragment of baked clay sitting quietly inside a protective case. It's not huge. It's about the size of a paperback book. If you walked past it without context, you might not think twice. But it has a name in the catalogue, CBS 10673, and on its surface are wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay around 1600 BCE in the ancient Sumerian city of Nippur. Later, a fire swept through the place where it was stored and baked it hard, accidentally preserving it. The tablet is damaged, corners are missing, columns of text are gone, whole sections are simply not there anymore. And yet what remains is enough to keep scholars uneasy. This is the fragment we now call the Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest surviving flood accounts ever found. Most people hear ancient flood story and they immediately picture myth, metaphor, poetry, big emotions, divine anger, symbolic punishment, that kind of thing. And yes, the text absolutely has that tone in places. It talks about antediluvian cities. It mentions divine councils. It frames history as something negotiated by powers above humanity. But then you run into something that feels different. In between the familiar mythic beats, you find passages that sound oddly procedural, like someone is describing operations, not telling a legend. The wording can feel precise, almost clinical, not the kind of poetic exaggeration you'd expect from a Bronze Age religious story, but the kind of language you'd expect from people trying to explain how something works. And the most unsettling part is how often these texts talk about weapons, not just in the generic gods, our powerful sense, but with term sequences and descriptions that read like capability lists. There's a Sumerian word that shows up again and again, too cool. Most translations render it as something simple like weapon or mace. But the lines around too cool don't always sound like a bronze club. They sound like something else. Weapons that move on their own. Weapons that know where to go. Weapons that communicate with their user. Weapons that can split mountains and boil seas, phrases that, yes, could be poetry, except the surrounding descriptions sometimes feel less like metaphor and more like a record of effects. For most of the last century, the safest scholarly move has been to file these passages under the usual categories: religious symbolism, mythic language, rhetorical authority, priest-kings asserting cosmic control, gods personifying storms, fire, plague, and war. And honestly, that interpretation makes sense. It's methodologically careful. It fits what we see in a lot of ancient cultures. But there's another question that refuses to go away. What if the Sumerians were doing something else at the same time? What if, alongside the theology and the poetry, they were also preserving descriptions? Descriptions as accurate as their language would allow of arsenals they believed were real. What if they were copying older source material? What if they inherited technical knowledge they didn't fully understand but felt compelled to preserve anyway? Because here's the thing, these weapon descriptions don't just appear on one tablet. They appear across dozens of tablets from different cities, sometimes separated by centuries and hundreds of miles, and the terminology stays surprisingly consistent. The types of weapons repeat, the effects repeat, the patterns repeat. And that consistency is a problem, at least. It's a problem if you want to treat everything as spontaneous, poetic invention. Back in that museum vault, the environment is perfectly stable. 68 degrees, humidity controlled, no sunlight, no variation. The clay fragment just sits there holding its wedge marks like a memory frozen in time. And somewhere in those wedge marks is information that conventional archaeology has a hard time explaining cleanly. Not because archaeology is weak, but because the texts themselves are strangely specific. So tonight we're going to start an investigation together. One simple question: what were the Sumerians actually describing? And if you're listening from somewhere quiet, maybe you're in bed with the lights low, maybe you're sitting in a chair at the end of a long day, drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is, because this is going to be a long, slow journey. We're going to move carefully, no rushing, no jumping to conclusions, just following the text and seeing what patterns emerge. To do that, we need context. Mesopotamia. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates becomes the stage for what we usually call the birth of civilization. Around 3500 BCE, the Sumerians established the first true cities in the southern plains: Eridu, Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Lagash. They built irrigation networks that turned flat land into farmland. They raised ziggurats, stepped temple mountains in a landscape that had no natural mountains. They developed mathematics, administrative systems, law codes, astronomy, and most crucially, they invented writing. At first, writing was practical. It tracked grain stores, temple inventories, labour assignments, who delivered what when and how much. But the system evolved. The wedge marks became flexible enough to carry stories, prayers, histories, arguments between gods, and records of events that the scribes treated as significant. And the Sumerians had something else that still stands out: their language. Sumerian is a linguistic isolate. It doesn't neatly connect to the Semitic languages that later dominated the region. It doesn't resemble Indo-European languages either. It's its own thing, like a lone surviving branch of a tree whose other limbs are gone. When Sumerian civilization declined around 2000 BCE, the language didn't vanish immediately. It became sacred. Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian scribes continued to learn Sumerian the way medieval scholars learned Latin as a language of ritual scholarship and ancient authority. For thousands of years after Sumer died as a living culture, its clay libraries remained buried. And then something even stranger happened. For nearly 4,000 years, nobody on Earth could read the script anymore. The last fluent readers died out sometime in the 1st century CE. After that, those wedge marks became decoration, curiosities, museum oddities brought back by travellers. People could hold a tablet in their hands and have no idea whether it was a shopping list or a cosmic war record. The breakthrough began in the 1800s. In 1835, a British Army officer named Henry Rawlinson started copying a massive inscription carved into a cliff at Behistun in Persia, an inscription ordered by Darius the Great. It was written in multiple languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. Rawlinson could work with Old Persian. That became the key that opened Babylonian. and Babylonian opened the door to Akkadian. By the 1850s, scholars could read Akkadian texts. Sumerian took longer. It was harder. It didn't behave like Akkadian, but by the late 1800s, translations became reliable enough that the ancient libraries began speaking again. And what they said shocked the modern world. These texts described gods, yes, but not just as abstract spirits. The beings called the Anunnaki appear as rulers, administrators, decision makers. They hold assemblies, they assign territories, they issue decrees, they argue, they form factions, and when negotiations fail, they go to war. And the wars are described with an odd mix of reverence and procedure. Weapons are named, weapon effects are described, tactical deployments are laid out, aftermath is recorded in terms that sound geological, plains, burned cities, buried land, made uninhabitable. By 1889, American archaeologists from the University of Pennsylvania began major excavations at Nippur, about 100 miles south of modern Baghdad. Nippur was ancient even by Sumerian standards, a holy city devoted to Enlil Lord Wind, one of the supreme powers of the Sumerian pantheon. Those excavations lasted years and pulled up more than 30,000 cuneiform tablets, among them flood texts like the Eridu Genesis. Also epics like Lugali, which catalogues the exploits and weapons of Ninurta. Also King lists that claim rain stretching back before the flood. Also temple inventories listing Tukuldinger, weapons of the gods, as physical items housed and managed like real objects. And that's where the puzzle really begins. While Nippur was giving up its tablets to Penn's expedition, other museums were building their own collections. The British Museum, for example, amassed thousands of tablets from Nineveh, the old Assyrian capital, including what we now call the Library of Ashurbanipal. That library is one of the reasons we can read so much Mesopotamian literature today. It preserved copies of creation epics, war narratives, hymns, and ritual texts that were already ancient when Assyrian scribes copied them. And inside those texts, you keep running into the same unsettling theme. Divine conflict described with the vocabulary of logistics and capability. The Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, is usually read as theology, and it is. It's about legitimacy, cosmic order, and who has the right to rule. But woven into the story is a detailed catalogue of weapons. Not vague God is strong language, but lists of tools, effects, and tactical steps. Another major text, the Era Epic, describes a war god rampaging through Babylonia with 7 specific weapons, each with a distinct role. Other tablets talk about weapons as if they are assets stored in temples and handled with caution, not just metaphors in poems. By the early 1900s, scholars could read these languages fluently, but reading and understanding are not the same thing. So a mainstream interpretation formed, and it still dominates today. It goes like this. Mesopotamian texts are mythological. They encode religious meaning. They express political ideology. They use symbolic language to describe natural forces. Storm gods use lightning because storms feel like weapons. Floods are divine judgment because floods destroy everything. Radiance and terror describe awe, not technology. When a text says a weapon split mountains, that is poetic exaggeration to communicate overwhelming power, not a literal battlefield report. That approach is careful and it's reasonable. It's also consistent with how mythology is treated in other cultures. Greek gods throw thunder. Norse gods wield impossible weapons. Ancient societies everywhere describe the world in mythic terms. So in that framework, the weapons of the Anunnaki become symbols. The weapons represent authority, order, and control. A king says he carries the weapon of a god because he claims divine legitimacy. A temple lists a weapon because it lists cult objects and ceremonial items. The language is vivid because religious literature is vivid. All of that makes sense, but here is the tension. To make that interpretation work cleanly, you usually have to wave away the procedural parts. You have to treat the technical sounding phrasing as just another kind of poetic flourish. You have to treat consistent operational details across multiple cities and centuries as the result of a stable literary tradition, not as a stable description of something. And you have to explain why the same weapon is described in remarkably similar ways again and again. Not always with identical wording, but with the same functions. It scouts. It flies. It reports. It strikes without a hand guiding it. It can be aimed at distant targets. Its effects linger. It must be kept sealed. It must be kept dormant. When you see those patterns, the story stops feeling like a one-off myth and starts feeling like a repeating technical motif. Then there's another detail that tends to get overlooked because it sounds religious on the surface, but it behaves differently when you pay attention. The Mesopotamians did not treat divine weapons as purely imaginary. They built temples that housed them. They wrote inventories for them. They wrote rituals designed to keep them asleep. They wrote prayers asking to be protected from specific named weapons. They wrote warnings about what happens when certain powers are stirred. If it's all metaphor, why does it look so much like risk management? That question leads to a second possibility, and this is where things get controversial. What if the scribes were preserving history as they understood it? Not history in the modern sense with dates and footnotes, but history as memory transmitted through generations, copied into clay because it mattered. What if the Anunnaki were not gods in the simple modern fantasy sense, but a category label, those who from heaven to earth came used for beings or forces that were perceived as superior ruling and technologically overwhelming? You don't have to decide that these beings were supernatural. You don't have to decide they were aliens either. All you have to do for now is entertain the idea that the texts may be describing events that the writers believed were real and weapons that they believed existed using the best descriptive tools available in their language. If you put that lens on the vocabulary, it starts to feel different. You begin to notice the way these texts talk about weapons as systems rather than props. You see references to weapons that act autonomously, weapons that can be dispatched and recalled, weapons that communicate, weapons that are described with activation procedures, weapons that leave behind environments that remain dangerous. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. So instead of trying to solve the entire mystery in one leap, the best approach is to start where the tablets start, with the weapons themselves. One weapon in particular stands out immediately because it does the one thing weapons are not supposed to do. It speaks. In the Oxford Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature, there's a composite text assembled from dozens of fragments found across Mesopotamia. Scholars stitch these pieces together, the way you'd rebuild a shattered vase. You compare repeated lines, you align overlaps, you reconstruct what likely belongs where. The result is a text often called Lugal-e, or by its common title, Ninurta's Exploits. It dates in its written form to the early 2nd millennium BCE, though many scholars believe it preserves older traditions. The story itself is classic epic structure. Ninurta, a warrior god, confronts a dangerous entity in the mountains called Asag. The narrative describes the battle and its consequences for the land. But the text also pauses repeatedly to catalogue Ninurta's arsenal. And among his weapons is one that behaves less like an object and more like an agent. The Shur or Shurur. Translations vary, but the name is often rendered as something like Royal Hunter or that which smites thousands. Even that title hints at function, not decoration. The Shurur is described as having wings. It travels through the air. It does reconnaissance. It delivers messages. It returns with information. And in several passages, it speaks directly in dialogue. One preserved segment describes the weapon travelling to a shrine to speak to Enlil, who is portrayed as Ninurta's father and a supreme authority. The weapon announces itself like a messenger. It explains why it came. It carries a question. It asks for guidance. Then it returns, and it reports back, not just with words, but with assessment. It describes the threat. It evaluates the enemy's posture. It warns about motives. It recommends action. That is an intelligence cycle. A Bronze Age scribe is describing a weapon that functions as reconnaissance and communication with autonomous travel and return. And the text does it in a tone that feels routine, like this is simply what this weapon does. The conventional view is that this is personification, a literary device. Ancient literature is full of talking swords and named weapons. The epic tradition likes to give agency to tools. It makes the story richer. It gives the hero a companion that is not another human. And yes, that could be what's happening here. But the Shura is not written like a poetic talking sword that brags about itself. It is written like a subordinate system, obedient, mission-oriented, deployed with instructions, returning with a report, receiving updated direction. Some hymns add details that tighten the picture. The Shura flies in front, knows the mountains like a bird, and issues from the god like fire. Other lines claim that no god can fully comprehend its course, and no god can turn it back once it is set on its path. That last part is especially strange. It suggests something that once launched cannot easily be interrupted. Something with a programmed trajectory perhaps. Something that does not simply hover waiting for new orders. Then you start noticing a contrast that shows up in multiple places across Mesopotamian texts. Ordinary weapons require a hand to guide them. These weapons do not. The texts praise this as exceptional. They treat it as a mark of supreme capability, a weapon that knows its path, a weapon that goes forth at command and returns at bidding, a weapon that requires no hand. Whether you read that as metaphor or specification, the consistent emphasis is the same. Autonomy is the feature being highlighted, and now the question becomes more focused. If a culture has no vocabulary for guidance, systems, propulsion sensors, or artificial intelligence, what words do they use instead? They use birds, they use servants, they use knowing, they use speaking, they use obedience. A device that flies becomes winged. A device that returns becomes obedient. A device that reports becomes speaking. A device that navigates becomes knowing the way. And that brings us to a choice that will follow us through this entire investigation. Do we treat these phrases as imaginative myth, or do we treat them as the closest language available for describing capabilities that felt real to the writers? The tablets don't stop at the shurur, they keep going. They list more weapons with more functions and effects that grow harder and harder to reduce to simple symbolism. Once you accept that the shurur is being described as an autonomous system, the rest of Ninurta's arsenal starts to look less like a poetic accessory list and more like an organised inventory. Not in the sense of a modern spreadsheet, obviously, but in the sense of categorised capabilities. Roles. Tools designed to do specific things in a specific order. And that's where the tone of these texts becomes even stranger, because the writing keeps sliding between reverence and operational description. In Lugali and related hymns, the next weapon that shows up constantly is the mitu. You'll see translators render mitu as mace weapon power, sometimes even just strength. It sounds generic at first, like the shura was the special one, and the mitu is just the standard divine club. But the descriptions refuse to behave like that. One passage says the mitu strikes the mountains and they split. It hits the earth and it convulses. Another line emphasizes that its strike cannot be deflected. This isn't just it's strong, this is it produces structural failure on a scale that affects terrain. Then you find one detail that keeps resurfacing across multiple texts, and it hits like a cold drop of water. Ground turned to glass. Not a metaphor like it shined, not it looked like glass. The language is about transformation, sand and earth fused, surfaces vitrified. To create glass from sand, you need extreme heat. And not a campfire extreme. You need temperatures high enough to melt silica. Lightning can do it in tiny tubes. Large-scale vitrification requires sustained, focused heat. Ancient cities can burn hot. Conflagrations can bake bricks. But the texts describe vitrification in ways that sound localized, targeted like a strike zone, rather than an entire city burning evenly. And here's what makes this more than a literary curiosity. Archaeologists have actually found vitrified material at certain ancient sites. Walls and bricks fused in ways that indicate very high temperatures. Usually the explanation is intense fire during destruction. A city set ablaze, structures collapsing, heat, trapped temperatures spiking. Sometimes that's convincing, sometimes it isn't. Because in some cases, the vitrification is not uniformly distributed the way you'd expect from a broad fire. It appears in concentrated areas. It looks almost like a directed event where some sections received extreme heat while adjacent sections did not. The texts repeatedly attribute this exact type of effect to specific divine weapons. So the mitu starts to look like a capability marker, a weapon that produces catastrophic energy release. Then there's another weapon in Ninurta's arsenal, usually translated as spear or lance, the shukur. A spear is an easy mental image. You picture a warrior with a long bronze tip, maybe thrown, maybe thrust. But the shukur in these descriptions does not behave like a thrown spear. It flies through the air, Yes, but the language emphasizes something else. Its light is seen before its strike is felt. That order matters. If you see light, then hear sound, then feel impact. You're looking at a sequence where the visible signature arrives first, sound arrives second, and physical effect arrives third. Light travels instantly compared to sound. Sound arrives later. That's why you see lightning and then hear thunder. In human weaponry, a thrown spear doesn't glow. A bronze spear doesn't announce itself as light. It also doesn't strike beyond line of sight as a normal battlefield tool. But the shukur is described reaching targets at distances that feel more like long-range engagement than hand-thrown weapons. There are lines implying it crosses mountains. It reaches places too far for ordinary weapons. So now you have a pattern forming inside one divine arsenal. Autonomous aerial system for reconnaissance and communication, Shura. High energy strike system capable of terrain, level damage, and heat transformation, Mitu. Long range strike system with visible signature and impact sequence, Shukur. Then you encounter the Jitukul, sometimes rendered as a wooden weapon, which sounds ridiculous in context because nothing about it reads like wood. The word might be an old label for shape, not material, or it might be a term that survived while the actual thing being described changed over time in people's understanding. What matters is how the text describes what it does. It bends without breaking. It strikes without being seen. It passes through shields and armour as if they were air. One tablet describes Ninurta using it against fortified positions. The weapon bends around walls, enters a fortress without breaking a gate, and the people inside collapse. The line that hits hardest is this: they fall without wounds that bleed. Their bodies are whole but lifeless. That's the kind of detail that makes modern readers sit upright, because the text is not describing stabbing, slashing, or blunt trauma. It's describing incapacitation without visible external injury. And again, the conventional reading is to treat this as mythic exaggeration. A god is unstoppable. His weapon is so powerful it ignores defences. His enemies die easily. End of story. But the text doesn't just say he defeated them. It describes effects. It describes barrier penetration without physical breach. It describes death or incapacitation without blood. It describes a weapon that doesn't rely on ammunition, doesn't rely on stones or arrows, and doesn't need a hand to guide it. A Bronze Age scribe trying to describe a directed energy weapon would use exactly this kind of phrasing. You can't say microwave, you can't say electromagnetic pulse, you can't say high-powered radiation. You describe the results. It passes through walls. People collapse. No visible wounds. No projectile. And at this point, another term keeps showing up across Mesopotamian texts, not just in the Ninurta material, Melamu. Most translations call it terrifying radiance, awe-inspiring brilliance, the glow of divinity, the thing that makes mortals tremble when a god approaches. And yes, that is absolutely one way it functions. But in a large number of passages, Melamu also behaves like a deployable weapon effect. It can be put on like armour. It can be sent forth in front. It can be concentrated and directed. It can paralyse opponents. It can scatter armies without physical contact. A hymn describes it moving ahead of the god like a weaponized field. Enemies lose strength in their knees. Their minds become confused. They cannot stand. They cannot think clearly. They lose the will to fight. That is psychological warfare and physiological disruption rolled together. And the language sometimes implies it is a hazard, not just a metaphor. Approach the wrong statue without proper ritual, and you suffer the malamu. Enter the wrong sacred space unprepared, and you feel it. This starts sounding less like divine majesty and more like do not get too close to this without protection. Now stack these pieces together and you get something that resembles a modern capability suite. Reconnaissance and communication platform. Long-range precision strike with visible signature. High-energy strike that alters materials. Barrier-penetrating non-projectile weapon. Area effect system that disrupts bodies and minds. You can call that mythology and it still reads as coherent mythology. But you can also call it a structured arsenal, and it reads like doctrine. And the texts themselves often place these weapons in sequences that feel tactical. First reconnaissance, then engagement, then breach, then disruption, then finishing strike. The words don't say doctrine, but the structure behaves like doctrine. This is where temple material becomes important, because temple inventories don't read like epic poetry. They read like administration, lists, storage locations, who can approach what, how often something is inspected, what it must be wrapped in, what must be done to keep it dormant. Certain texts describe annual ceremonies where priests symbolically disarm weapons and return them to sleep. The language doesn't just praise the god, it emphasizes that the weapons must remain at rest, that peace depends on them being dormant, that their waking is dangerous. And that shifts the emotional tone of the whole topic. Because a culture that treats weapons as pure symbols doesn't usually build elaborate multi-day procedures to keep them asleep. They might celebrate them. They might honour them. They might reenact myths. But the language in these rituals often feels like risk control. And then you find physical details in some descriptions that feel oddly practical. Weapons stored behind multiple doors. Weapons kept in sealed darkness. Weapons wrapped in particular fabrics. Weapons kept away from sunlight. Weapons approached only by purified personnel. Even if you strip away the theological framework, those procedures sound like containment. Now the question becomes even more focused. If these were physical objects, what kind of objects require that level of control? A bronze mace does not. A ceremonial axe does not. But something hazardous does. Something that emits something. Something that can harm even when not actively used. Something that must be shut down properly and kept stable. And that idea shows up in the way the texts talk about activation. A weapon can be awakened. A weapon can be put to rest. A weapon can be partly awake. A weapon can respond when addressed. Those phrases can be metaphor. They can also be functional description from people trying to describe an operational state. Dormant, active, unstable, awake, sleeping. Then the story expands beyond Ninurta because the same pattern appears with other deities. The Era epic introduces the seven, the Sebetu, 7 units that operate together distributed across the land, striking as a coordinated system. The same number that shows up in other places in other forms, almost like a recurring design principle. A system broken into 7 components, each with a role. And that is where the investigation moves next, because once you leave Ninurta's arsenal, you step into something that feels even more like a network. Not a single god holding a weapon, but a coordinated set of weapon entities moving together like a formation. The 7 that strike together. In the Era epic, the 7 are introduced in a way that feels different from how gods are usually introduced. They are not born, they are built. That detail matters because ancient Near Eastern texts have plenty of divine genealogies. Gods typically emerge from other gods, or from primordial forces, or from cosmic beginnings. They have family trees, they have relationships, but the 7 are described more like purpose-made instruments. The language frames them as crafted for a specific function, not as personalities that just happen to like war. And the function is blunt. They exist to reduce humanity when humanity becomes too loud, too numerous, too difficult to manage. That's already a chilling motive, because it turns a mythic flood story into a policy problem. Not morality, not sin, not wickedness. Noise, population, system overload. The 7 are not described as vague disasters either. Each has a role, each strikes from a position, each contributes a different kind of effect. Front sides above below. Darkness. Wind that carries death. Fire that withers without flame. Those aren't poetic adjectives. Those are categories of impact. And when the 7 move, the epic emphasizes coordination. They advance at a command. They spread across a region like they are taking assigned positions. They strike as if they share a single mind. One passage describes them communicating without voice, knowing each other's position without sight, striking together without a signal. That reads like data link, like shared targeting, like synchronized operations. A Bronze Age poet would not have those concepts, but a Bronze Age observer could describe the behavior. No voice, no visible signal, still coordinated, still precise, still acting like a unit. Then the text describes what happens to the places they hit. First, physical destruction, structures, collapsing ground, splitting. Then darkness thick enough that people cannot see. Then breathing fails, lungs burn, people choke. Then a lingering aftermath land, empty survivors fleeing, and nothing growing in the affected areas for years. That sequence is specific enough that it feels like a report, not a single dramatic moment, a cascade. Impact, atmosphere, physiology, persistence. You could interpret that as mythic storytelling, or you could treat it as a description of multiple linked effects from a single strike package. A strike that creates debris and particulates, producing darkness. A strike that creates chemical or toxic conditions, producing respiratory distress. A strike that leaves long-term contamination, producing barren ground and flight. Even the emotional detail is telling. The epic says the gods themselves were uneasy, that they did not like what the 7 did once they were unleashed. Not because it was morally wrong in a modern sense, but because it looked out of control, too severe, too comprehensive. And then you find another layer. These 7 show up outside the epic. They appear in incantations, not just worship but warding language. Keep them away from my house. Do not let them approach my gate. Hold them at the edges of the world. That kind of ritual behaviour makes sense if the threat is perceived as real and repeatable. People don't usually perform repeated defensive rites against an abstract metaphor. They do perform repeated defensive rites against storms and disease, yes, but notice how the rites speak about the 7 as if they were entities that can be positioned and restrained. They can be stationed. They can be kept dormant. They can be held back. That is a very different vibe from please stop raining. Then there's a weird association in some texts that link the 7 to the Pleiades, a cluster of 7 visible stars. That could be symbolism, but it could also be observational comparison. If you saw 7 lights moving together in formation, what would you compare them to? A tight group of lights in the sky. 7 lights that travel together. The Pleiades. Again, that doesn't prove anything. It just shows you how the writers might anchor a strange sight to something familiar. At this point, the pattern is obvious enough that you can start describing it without committing to an answer. The weapon texts repeatedly describe systems that are autonomous, coordinated, and capable of effects that persist after impact. And they are treated not only as literary ideas, but as things that require containment. That containment theme becomes even clearer when the texts begin talking about storage. Not storage as in keep the idol safe, but storage as in keep this sealed so it stays asleep. Certain temple administrative texts list items like weapons of a god stored behind multiple doors. Certain ritual texts describe opening a sealed chamber at dawn after purification, unwrapping something, carefully reciting an awakening sequence, and transporting it while avoiding direct gaze. Avoid direct gaze is a phrase that shows up enough to make you pause. If it's purely about reverence, you'd expect language about humility and awe. But the practical tone feels closer to hazard mitigation. Don't look directly. Avert your eyes. Approach only with authorized attendants. Keep it wrapped. Keep it sealed. Keep it in darkness. Do not expose it to sunlight. Those are environmental constraints, not just religious gestures. Then you encounter the story that ties many of these weapon descriptions together because it introduces a concept that feels like command authority. The Tablet of Destinies. In the myth of Anzu, the tablet is not treated like a symbolic crown. It's treated like a control device. When it is taken, operations stop. The gods freeze. Offices cease. Authority collapses. That is system failure. A central node removed from a network. Then the narrative problem becomes tactical. How do you attack an enemy who has captured your command authority? How do you attack an enemy who can issue orders to your own weapon systems? The text explicitly describes this. Gods refuse to volunteer because Anzu can decree their fate and command the weapons that strike on their own. That phrase is key. Weapons that strike on their own. Autonomous systems. And the tablet grants control over them. Then the advice given is tactical, and it's not mystical advice. Attack before he can speak. Do not give him time to issue commands. Do not rely on the autonomous weapons. Close distance. Use direct force. Deny communication. That reads like doctrine for fighting when a command and control system has been compromised. Modern militaries talk about degraded operations when networks go down. They train for manual fallback. They train for speed and surprise to prevent an enemy from exploiting system access. The story describes something similar in its own language. The first attempt fails because Anzu issues commands through the tablet and Ninurta's weapons deactivate or reverse. Arrows fail in flight. Bows lose function. That is not how mythology usually describes magic. It is unusually procedural. He commanded and the system did X. Then a second attempt fails because Ninurta's strength is reduced through decree. That could be metaphor, sure, or it could be described as physiological disruption. Then the successful tactic uses noise and wind to cover the approach, disrupting Anzu's ability to communicate commands. Communication denial. And then the tablet is physically seized. Authority returns. Operations resume. System restoration. The myth is doing something very specific. It is presenting a model where the control of autonomous weapons depends on possession of an authority object, a central device that transmits decrees. Without it, systems fail. With it, systems obey. Now add one more piece. The flood texts. In the Atrahasis account, the flood is not weather got angry. It is a solution deployed through decision. A council agrees. A command is issued. Bolts are drawn. Locks are opened. Waters above and waters below are released. The language describes containment gates being opened, not clouds spontaneously gathering. And the story includes a detail that makes the whole thing feel like mishandled power. The gods themselves become frightened by what they unleashed. That sounds like a weapon exceeding the expectations of those who authorized it. Then after the flood, there's a policy adjustment. Humanity continues, but with constraints. No more flood deployment. Promises made. Rituals later performed to reaffirm that the locks remain sealed. This creates a consistent worldview. There are systems. They require authorization. They require activation procedures. They can be deployed. They can go out of control. They require containment. And they are not always fully understood, even by the beings who use them. That worldview might be purely mythological, but it is an unusually system-oriented mythology. So the investigation moves into a more grounded place, because there is one category of texts that is hard to wave away as poetic imagination: administrative inventories. If you look at temple inventories, the genre is different. It's not epic. It's not hymn. It's not prophecy. It is accounting, and the accounting lists weapons, not as concepts, as objects, wrapped in linen, stored in sealed rooms, kept behind multiple doors, inspected on specific dates, handled by specific personnel, reported to the king if damaged. That's where the story becomes less about interpretation and more about what the tablets literally say in their day-to-day language. Because even if you decide every epic is metaphor, the inventories still tell you something simple. The people who ran the temples acted as if these weapons were real things that needed real procedures. And that takes us into the temple underworld, the sealed chambers, the metal-lined rooms, the strange engineering choices that do not make much sense for storing a bronze axe, but make a lot more sense if you are trying to isolate something hazardous. That is the next clue in the clay. If you want to understand why temple inventories matter, picture the difference between a bedtime story and a warehouse log. An epic can use exaggeration. A hymn can use metaphor. A myth can bend reality to make a point. But an inventory is supposed to help someone find something, store something, and keep it from becoming a problem. And the Mesopotamian inventories that mention divine weapons are written in that practical voice. They use location language. They use handling language. They use timing language. They sound like somebody is trying to make sure the next shift does not mess this up. Some tablets list what is stored where, what it is wrapped in, who is allowed to approach it, and what doors separate it from the rest of the building. You see repeated patterns like sealed chamber behind doors wrapped in linen, kept in darkness, kept separate. And the separation is emphasized, not just for respect, but for control. Certain items are stored together. Certain items are never stored together. Certain containers must remain sealed. Certain chambers must remain closed except on specific ritual dates. Then you look at the architecture underneath some of these temples. Excavators have found sealed rooms and underground spaces that are unusually precise. Walls that are smoother and straighter than typical mud brick construction. Floors that are level in a way that feels intentional, like someone cared about alignment, not just stability. Ventilation shafts, drainage systems, and access corridors that suggest the builders planned for something being kept down there for a long time. The strangest detail in some reports is the use of metal lining in underground chambers. copper sheets, lead sheets, sometimes both. If you're storing bronze ceremonial weapons, that is a weird choice. Bronze is tough, copper is softer, lead is very soft. Neither would protect bronze from damage. So if the goal was keep thieves out, metal lining is not the obvious solution either. You would build thicker walls, add more doors, bury the chamber deeper. Metal lining suggests a different goal: isolation, shielding, containment. Even if you don't jump to modern interpretations like radiation, you can still say this: the builders were concerned about some form of influence moving through walls, something they wanted to block or reduce, something they wanted kept separate from the surrounding structure. Now connect this to the texts that insist some weapons must be kept sealed, wrapped, dormant, and not exposed to sunlight. That starts sounding less like a treasure vault and more like a controlled environment. There are also texts that describe maintenance and inspection, not worship, inspection. Bring the item out on a specific date. Unwrap it carefully. Check for wear. Rewrap it in new linen. Return it to the chamber. Notify the king if damage is found. If you are dealing with a symbolic artifact, damage matters because it is embarrassing. It is a religious failure. It is a political insult. But the tone in some of these protocols feels more like, if this is compromised, it becomes a hazard. The involvement of the king is interesting too. Not every temple maintenance issue triggers royal attention, yet these weapons sometimes do. That implies strategic value or strategic risk. And there are stories embedded in chronicles and ritual commentaries that describe consequences when procedures fail. Priests open a chamber without correct purification. People fall ill. Some die within days. The object is sealed again and left alone for a long period. The language in these accounts often frames the danger as the weapon was not fully put to rest. It was partly awakened. When the seals broke, its power emerged unchecked. That phrase, partly awakened, is telling. If you are dealing with an idea, it does not have an operational state. If you are dealing with a device, it does. Dormant, active, unstable, partly awake. And the idea of needing correct shutdown and containment procedures is exactly what you would expect for something that can harm even when not commanded. Now there's another category of evidence people tend to ignore because it sits quietly in museum catalogues. Actual objects, ceremonial maces, inscribed weapons, strange implements found in temple storage areas. Many of these are probably exactly what they look like: ritual weapons, symbolic items, dedication gifts, status objects. But some are odd. Some are made from unusual materials. Some have properties that are not easily explained. Some are described by excavators as heavier than expected for their size. Some show workmanship that feels unusually precise, even when the culture clearly had high craftsmanship. One recurring pattern is the use of meteoric iron in certain sacred objects. That is not mysterious. Ancient people prize meteoric iron because it is rare and it comes from the sky. It fits perfectly into divine symbolism, but the consistent association of sky materials with weapon language is at least suggestive of how people categorize power. Then there are the objects that are not typical weapons at all. Cylinders, canisters, hollow tubes, identical sets, numbers that match textual systems like the 7. Some excavations report sets of identical objects found together marked as belonging to a deity and described in inscriptions as weapons, even though their shapes look more like containers than blades. When you have a set of 7 identical cylinders, each sealed, each inscribed, and the text says, "the 7 that strike together," you don't have to decide what they are to notice the alignment. A system, a set, a unit, 7 pieces meant to function together. And museum policies often keep these objects unopened and unexamined beyond non-invasive methods, because opening sealed ancient containers can destroy whatever is inside, if anything is inside at all. So they sit in storage with labels like ritual object, symbolic weapon, unknown function. Now, if you were a Mesopotamian priest responsible for a dangerous object, what would you do? You would wrap it. You would store it in a sealed chamber. You would limit access. You would create procedures. You would create ritual language around those procedures so people follow them. Because rituals are sticky. They get repeated. They become culture. They can preserve safety practices even when the reason fades. That's one of the most practical insights here. Ritual can be a memory system. It can preserve protocol. A society can forget why a rule exists but still obey the rule if it is embedded in sacred practice. Do not open this door except on this date. Do not expose this object to sunlight. Do not look directly at it. Do not touch it unless you are purified. Do not store these items together. Perform offerings so it remains dormant. Again, you can interpret all of that as symbolic reverence, but it functions like safety engineering. Now step away from objects and return to language, because the language itself behaves differently in these weapon texts compared to standard poetry. The verbs used in weapon deployment are often about positioning, dispatching, setting, releasing, sealing, drawing, bolts, opening, locks, awakening, putting to rest. Those are process verbs, not just emotional verbs, and the sequences are repeatable. Authorization, preparation, deployment, effect, return or shutdown, storage. Even if you strip all the technology speculation out, the structure remains. These texts are obsessed with process, and that obsession becomes important when you look at one of the strangest concepts in Mesopotamian thought, me. Me is a Sumerian term that is often translated as divine. Decrees, cosmic powers, principles of civilization, the order of things. In myths, gods possess me, distribute me, steal me, recover me. It sounds abstract, but in weapon context, me behaves like operational parameters. A weapon has its me. A weapon must be given its me. When me is lost, the weapon cannot function. When someone seizes the tablet of destinies, the me of the weapon ceases. That is a striking way to describe system dependency. It suggests that weapons have a set of rules that make them operate correctly, and those rules can be withheld, disrupted, or reassigned. If you wanted a Bronze Age equivalent of programming me is not a terrible candidate. It's not a perfect match. It is a complex religious concept, but in these contexts it acts like a functional layer. The weapon receives me. The weapon awakens and knows its purpose. That sounds like initialization. Now zoom out and look at the whole landscape of Mesopotamian divine warfare narratives. You have autonomous systems. You have coordinated multi-unit systems. You have command authority devices. You have deployment procedures. You have containment chambers. You have maintenance protocols. You have hazard warnings. And you have a culture that treats the weapons as real enough to store and manage. At this point, the story can't stay in the abstract. It has to test itself against a harder question. If these are just mythic ideas, why do they map so neatly onto system language? And if they are descriptions of something physical, Why is the archaeological record so quiet? That question forces you into the uncomfortable middle, because the truth, whatever it is, probably isn't a clean extreme. It may be that the texts preserve layered meaning, theology on top, memory underneath, procedure embedded inside ritual. Or it may be that human beings are simply excellent at building coherent symbolic systems that feel technical because they are copying inherited phrases without fully understanding their origins. So how do you move forward without getting lost? You pick a new angle. You step away from divine weapons for a moment and look at where the texts themselves admit uncertainty. The scribal notes, the colophons, those small lines at the bottom of tablets where a scribe says where he got the text, how he copied it, and what he hopes happens to it. Because in those notes you can hear something that is rarely captured in grand mythological narratives. An ancient person admitting they are copying something older than they are, admitting the original was damaged, admitting some lines were unclear, admitting they hope a future reader understands better. That is not the voice of someone inventing fiction for entertainment. That is the voice of someone preserving information they believe matters even when it is partially confusing. And that shifts the emotional weight of the whole topic. These scribes were not just storytellers, they were archivists. And archivists preserve things because they fear what happens if the knowledge disappears. That is where the next clue lives. Not in the epic poetry itself, but in the quiet lines scribes left behind, the messages in the margins that reveal what they thought they were doing when they pressed wedge marks into clay. When you read the colophons, the mood changes. A colophon is the little note a scribe adds at the end of a tablet. Sometimes it's a blessing, sometimes it's a warning, sometimes it's a filing label, and sometimes it's an admission. Copied from an older original, checked against ancient tablets, some lines broken, some parts unclear, preserved for the one who may understand. That voice feels modern in a strange way, because it is the voice of someone who knows they are working with incomplete information. Someone who knows their copy might be all that survives. Someone who is aware that meaning can fade even when words remain. These scribes were not improvising, they were transmitting. And one of the most important things a colophon can reveal is the relationship between the copy and its source. In several cases, scribes explicitly say they copied from ancient originals kept in a temple archive, or they say the original was found in ruins and was damaged, or they say they collated multiple partial copies to reconstruct a composite. That matters because it means even in the Bronze Age, scribes were dealing with material that felt old to them. They were inheriting, repairing, preserving, and recopying, not inventing from scratch. Then you notice something else. Some colophons are protective. Do not erase this tablet. Do not break it. Do not remove it from the house of tablets. May the reader understand. May the knowledge not be lost. Again, you could interpret that as religious piety. You could say it's just scribes dramatizing their work. But the emotional logic fits another possibility too. If a text contains procedures that people fear or knowledge that people treat as dangerous, that knowledge becomes sacred. Not because it is pretty, but because it is powerful. And in Mesopotamia, power and sacredness are tied together. A weapon can be sacred. A boundary stone can be sacred. A curse can be sacred. A list of dangerous names can be sacred. So when a scribe protects a tablet, it may not be because the story is beautiful. It may be because the content is treated like an asset or a hazard or both. This is where the concept of the house of tablets becomes important. Temples and palaces were archives, not libraries in the modern sense, but working repositories. The tablets stored there included myths, yes, but also inventories, contracts, medical recipes, omens, astronomical observations, and instructions for rituals that were effectively protocols. If you want to understand how a society preserves complex procedures across centuries, you look at its institutional memory. That is what these archives were. Now, think about what happens when an institution inherits protocols without fully understanding them. The protocol persists if it appears to work. If you perform a procedure and the outcome is good, you keep doing it. If you ignore a procedure and the outcome is bad, you tighten the rule. Over time, the reasons fade, but the steps remain. That is how rituals can preserve engineering. Not because people are secretly scientists, but because people are good at repeating patterns that keep them safe. This framework helps explain a weird feature in the divine weapon corpus. Certain texts do not just praise weapons, they manage weapons. They describe how to keep them dormant. They describe how to approach them. They describe what not to do. They describe what happens when you do it wrong. And the way they describe consequences is not vague. It can be painfully specific. People fall ill within a number of days. A group of attendants dies. Others suffer for months. The object is sealed again. The area is avoided for a set period. Those are quarantine patterns. Even if you interpret the illness as divine punishment, the response looks like containment. Seal, isolate, wait, do not expose more people. Then you can ask a simple human question. Why would a society build institutional routines around sealing a weapon if it is purely symbolic? A symbolic weapon can be stolen or damaged, sure, but it doesn't kill people who open the wrong door. So this pushes you toward a more nuanced interpretation, not gods were aliens, not everything is metaphor, but a middle concept. These communities treated certain objects and certain forces as operational realities. They built procedures around them. They embedded those procedures in sacred practice, so they would not be forgotten. Now, if you want to test that concept, you need a case where a text describes something like a weapon, but in a context that is not obviously epic fantasy. Something that intersects with normal human reality. That brings you to a story that is half myth, half practical fear, because it sits in the space where a king is supposed to keep order. Plague. In Mesopotamia, plague is not an abstract metaphor. It is a real threat that collapses cities. It empties streets, it breaks economies, it turns temples into places of desperation. The god associated with plague and war in different traditions is sometimes framed as a weapon wielder, not just a personality, a carrier of forces that move invisibly, and the text describes something that looks like a wind but acts like a weapon, a wind that enters. A wind that fills the body, a wind that causes swelling and inability to close the mouth, a wind that leaves places barren, a wind that turns land dead. This is where the language becomes eerie, because a wind is the perfect metaphor for something you cannot see, something that moves through air, something that enters the lungs, something that spreads. But the texts treat wind as a tool wielded in tactical sequence. Perimeter winds that prevent escape, an entering wind that incapacitates from within. Then the killing projectile. It is described as strategy, not weather. Now you might think, okay, but myth writers love that kind of imagery. True, but the technical rhythm keeps showing up. Place, position, send, release, fill, trap, strike, return, seal, and those verbs appear in the same kinds of sequences in different stories and different eras. At some point you stop asking, is this literal? And you start asking, what kind of thinking produces this language? It produces systems thinking. It produces the idea that power is not random. It is applied. It is managed. It is controlled through procedures. It is stored, deployed, and shut down. That is not just a literary aesthetic. It is a worldview. Now, in that worldview, a central object like the Tablet of Destinies makes perfect sense. A control artifact, a device of authority. Whoever possesses it can command the weapons that act on their own. And when it is stolen, normal operations halt. That is the kind of narrative that emerges naturally in a culture that treats authority as functional. Authority is not merely legitimacy. Authority is the ability to make systems work. Then you realize something else. The Mesopotamian gods behave like administrators. They assign territories. They hold councils. They negotiate. They issue decrees. They punish. They reward. They argue about policy. They complain about noise. They implement population control measures. They discuss unintended consequences. This is not how gods behave in purely mystical traditions. It is how ruling institutions behave. So even if you interpret the gods as symbolic, the symbolism is anchored to bureaucracy, to statecraft, to governance. And in a bureaucratic worldview, weapons are not just symbols. Weapons are assets. Weapons are managed. Weapons require protocols. Weapons can be compromised. Weapons can be stolen. Weapons can be mishandled. Weapons can cause disasters that require policy changes. All of this sets up an important pivot. If you want to evaluate whether these weapon texts preserve anything beyond poetry, you look at the consistency of operational structure across genres. Epic narratives describe weapons in tactical sequence. Ritual texts describe how to manage and restrain weapons. Inventories list weapons as stored objects with handling requirements. Colophons reveal scribes copying older originals with care. Medical texts describe symptoms associated with certain winds and radiances. Astronomical texts link certain weapon systems to clusters of lights in the sky. Different genres, different purposes, same underlying pattern. And when multiple genres keep pointing toward the same idea, it becomes harder to dismiss everything as a single poetic trick. At the same time, it becomes risky to declare certainty, because all of these texts still operate inside a mythological framework. They speak of gods, not engineers. They speak of destinies, not networks. They speak of radiance, not radiation. They speak of wind, not aerosol. The language is metaphorical because it is the only language available. So the responsible move is to treat the metaphors as data, not as proof. Metaphors preserve observed effects. They preserve operational behaviour. They preserve how something felt and what it did. If an ancient person watched a device create blinding light and disabling fear, they would call it terrifying radiance. If an ancient person watched an invisible agent sweep through a city and collapse breathing, they would call it an evil wind. If an ancient person watched a group of 7 lights move together and strike in coordinated fashion, they would describe a 7 that moves as one mind in 7 bodies. That is how observation becomes myth. Not because people are lying, because people are translating the unknown into the familiar. At this point, the investigation needs a different kind of grounding. Not another weapon catalogue, not another epic battle, something that touches a specific physical site and a specific archaeological layer, something where the text and the ground can be compared without stretching language. And there is one scenario that keeps returning because it sits at the centre of Mesopotamian memory, and it leaves literal sediment behind. The flood, but not as morality, as deployment, as a decision made in council, as a gate opened, as waters released from above and below, as a catastrophe that produced a real layer of silt that excavators found centuries later. The flood is where myth meets geology, and if any ancient story can be tested against the ground, it is the one that claims the world was divided into before and after by water. So let's move into the flood layer, not as a Sunday school story, but as a procedural narrative. How the texts describe the mechanism, how archaeologists describe the sediment, and what it means when a myth contains both boat specifications and an activation sequence that sounds like opening containment locks. Imagine you are a scribe in a city built on a river plain. You live with water every day. You watch canals fill and empty. You watch crops depend on irrigation. You watch seasonal flooding roll in like clockwork, sometimes gentle, sometimes violent. So if you were going to write a story about a flood, you would have a lot of natural vocabulary. Rain, overflow, river, surge, levee, failure. But the major Mesopotamian flood accounts do something different. They describe a decision. They describe authorization. They describe a mechanism being opened. They describe water being released from above and below at the same time. And they describe the planners getting frightened by the scale of what they activated. That last part is the tell. Not because God's being scared proves anything literal, but because it expresses something very specific. The thing they released exceeded their prediction. That is not the emotional texture of a simple seasonal flood. It is the emotional texture of a failed containment event. Now in the flood narratives, the stated reason is human noise and overpopulation. That sounds like myth logic, but it also sounds like policy logic. A governing class deciding a population has become a management problem. The text doesn't treat it as a random tantrum, it treats it as a calculated solution after other measures failed. First plague, then drought, then famine. Each one works temporarily, then the problem returns. Then the final solution is approved. Even without any technology angle, this is a strange way to tell a myth. It reads like escalating interventions, like a committee trying different tools before resorting to the one they consider irreversible. Then the language sharpens. Words associated with doors, locks, bolts, gates, commands to open, commands to release, commands to unseal. A flood described as something that is brought forth and released, not just something that happens because clouds gather. If you are listening late at night, picture that image. Somewhere there is a gate, a lock, a bolt, and when it is opened, water comes. But not just rainwater, water from above, yes, and water from below, subterranean waters. Springs of the deep, channels that break. That dual sourcing is a big deal, because if you wanted to describe catastrophic flooding across a wide region, one of the most effective ways is a combined event, torrential storms, plus the sudden release of stored water. If you get both at once, you get an overwhelming, fast-rising inundation that feels unstoppable. In modern terms, you might think of a dam failure during a major storm, or an ice dam collapse combined with rain, or a sudden breach of levees across multiple points while the rivers are already high. But the texts use opening language, not breaking language. They frame it like someone had control and then that control was exercised. Now, how does this connect to archaeology? Because in several cities in southern Mesopotamia, excavators found flood deposits, thick layers of silt and clay, separating older occupation layers from later ones. These deposits vary by site, which already tells you something important. It likely was not a single uniform global event. It was regional flooding that hit some places hard, some places less. And that's exactly how real floods work, even huge ones. Because the shape of the land, the way canals are cut, where levees stand and where rivers shift, can create very different experiences across short distances. So the existence of flood layers supports the idea of major regional flooding. But the text claims something more dramatic, a boundary in time, a dividing line, a before and after that becomes a cultural reference point. And that suggests the flood event, whatever its mechanism was, traumatic enough to reorder memory. Now here is the crucial question. If the flood was natural, why do the texts describe activation steps like opening locks? And if the flood was engineered, what could that even mean in the context of early Mesopotamia? Let's take the grounded explanation first. A natural flood can still be described as the gates were opened because ancient people commonly imagined the sky as having doors and the deep as having gates. In many mythologies, rain is stored in the heavens and released when divine doors open. So yes, locks and bolts can be cosmological imagery. But then you hit the practical detail. The narratives contain survival instructions. Not just build a boat, but dimensions, sealing methods, loading protocols, timelines, and a sense of urgency that reads like somebody is passing along a tested recipe for staying alive. This is where the texts feel less like pure symbolism and more like a memory of doing. Build the vessel, seal it completely, bring supplies, bring animals, shut the door, wait out the duration, then release birds to test for dry land. Those details are not necessary for theology, they are useful information. And useful information tends to survive when people have used it. Now consider the most unsettling part of these accounts. The divine decision makers regret it. They become hungry. They cluster around the sacrifice like desperate beings. They argue afterward. They impose population controls rather than repeating the flood. This reads like an institution learning a lesson. We use the strongest tool. It was too strong. We nearly wiped out the labour base. We cannot do that again. So we set new policies. That is policy and logistics dressed as myth. Again, this does not prove engineered flooding. It proves the text has the shape of an operational narrative. Now, to keep this from becoming repetitive, we need to broaden the frame. The flood story is not only about water, it is about a category of power. A category of power that can reshape the environment. And in Mesopotamian thought, the environment can be weaponized. Flood is one weapon. Plague is one weapon. Radiance is one weapon. Wind is one weapon. So the flood narrative should be read as part of a larger doctrine. If the problem is big enough, the solution can be environmental. That is chilling because it mirrors something modern societies have done. Not with floods, but with scorched earth, poisoned wells, salted fields, burned crops. Destroy the environment to control the population. Mesopotamian texts describe that kind of thinking, but scaled up to divine proportions. Now a new development appears in later ritual practice. There are ceremonies designed not to celebrate the flood, but to prevent its return. Priests symbolically seal gates. Priests recite formulas that reaffirm promises. Priests perform actions that look like a yearly check that the locks remain locked. This is where ritual looks like maintenance again, not worship. Maintenance. And if rituals function as maintenance, it means the society believed the threat remained possible. Even if the threat was symbolic, they treated it as a real risk. That is why these texts mattered in the first place. They were not just stories. They were instruments of governance and safety. Now, to move forward, we need to leave water and move into something that leaves a different kind of layer in the ground. Fire, heat, glass. Because floods laid down silt. But some sites in the region show layers of destruction that include vitrification fused materials and heat signatures that are difficult to explain through ordinary city burning. And the texts repeatedly describe weapons that turn ground to glass. If you want a test case where words and matter might meet vitrified layers, are a better target than distant cosmic battles. So the next step is to focus on the ground, turn to glass descriptions, and then compare them to what archaeologists actually find in burn layers without forcing conclusions. What does it take to vitrify sand and clay? What conditions create focused zones of fusion? And why would ancient texts keep mentioning this specific effect in multiple weapon contexts? That brings us to a different kind of evidence. Not stories about gods, not inventories, not colophons, but physical chemistry written into the earth. A surface that melted, cooled and froze in place. A battlefield signature, if that is what it is. Or an accident of fire, if that is what it is. Either way, it is measurable. And measurable things are where speculation has to slow down and become careful. If you've ever watched sand fuse into glass in a kiln video, you already know the basic truth. Glass is not a normal byproduct of fire. Not campfire fire, not house fire. You need serious heat sustained long enough for silica to soften and flow. You also need conditions that concentrate that heat, not just spread it around. That's why the phrase, "the ground turned to glass," is such a strange line to keep seeing in ancient weapon descriptions. Because even if you assume exaggeration, it's a specific exaggeration. It's not just the land was ruined, it's the surface changed phase. It's matter behaving differently. Now, there are natural ways this can happen. Lightning strikes can create fulgurites, those little glass tubes in sand. Meteor impacts can create glassy surfaces. Volcanic heat can fuse material. But the texts are not describing lightning. They're describing tactical deployment, a strike, a weapon, a deliberate action. And that matters because it points to a concept of directed heat, not a general blaze, a focused application. Now in city destruction layers, archaeologists sometimes find vitrified bricks, fused pottery, melted glazing, and in rarer cases fused sand or clay surfaces. The mainstream explanation is intense conflagration, especially if a city had oil resin timber and packed structures. That explanation makes sense in many cases. But the weird part is distribution. In some destruction events, vitrification appears in pockets. One area shows fusion and melt. A nearby area shows burning, but no fusion. Another area shows collapse without high heat. That can happen in a chaotic fire, yes. But it also fits something else. A targeted energy source. A strike zone. A focused blast. And here's the critical point. Even if you don't know what caused it, the pattern of focused vitrification invites comparison with texts that describe focused effects. Now, what kind of weapon effects could a Bronze Age observer describe as turning ground to glass? The simplest is a weapon that produces extreme heat at a point of contact. A beam of light, a concentrated radiance. A strike that arrives with a bright flash. A sound that follows. Then an impact that leaves fused material. Notice the pattern that appears in some texts: light first, then sound, then strike. That is not a random poetic rhythm. That is the real-world order of events when something energetic happens at a distance. You see it first because light is fast. You hear it second because sound lags. Then you feel the impact. That is how an explosion, a supersonic projectile, or a high energy discharge behaves. An arrow does not do that. A spear does not do that. A sling stone does not do that. Now, to make this more grounded, let's approach it like an investigator instead of a believer. Assume the scribes are describing something dramatic. Ask what could produce these observations. Observation 1. A bright light is seen at distance. Observation 2. A sound comes after. Observation 3. A strike occurs and surfaces fuse. Observation 4. Effects are localized. Observation 5. Survivors describe land being unusable after. Now we're back in that uncomfortable zone where multiple possibilities exist. One possibility is natural disaster memory mixed with war language. A meteor airburst, for example, produces bright light, delayed sound, intense heat, and localized devastation. People could easily interpret that as a weapon strike. Another possibility is industrial fire. If something like a storehouse of combustible materials burns hot enough, you can get localized fusion. Another possibility is an actual weapon effect, some kind of directed energy or high heat discharge that people describe as a divine strike. You don't have to pick one yet, but what you can do is notice that the texts keep describing the same sensory sequence in multiple contexts. And that suggests the sensory sequence was meaningful to the tradition. Now there is a second layer to this. Even when texts describe extreme heat and fusion, they often pair it with something else. A lingering hazard, a land that becomes dead, a place that must be avoided, a zone that requires purification, a territory that stays empty. This is where things get eerie because ordinary fire does not poison land for generations. Fires destroy, fires burn, fires scar. But once the ash settles, land can recover, sometimes quickly. So when a text insists a place stays dead for years, it implies something beyond burned crops. It implies contamination. Now in myth language, contamination is often moral. The land is cursed, the ground is angry, the place is unclean. But in practical terms, unclean can mean unsafe. If you have a place that makes people sick, you call it cursed and you avoid it. If you don't know why you build rituals around it, you declare taboos, you enforce distance, you treat it like a boundary. And that can preserve real safety practices. So when you see rituals that say, do not approach this chamber, or do not open these vessels together, or do not expose this object to sunlight, you can interpret them as theology. But they behave like hazard mitigation. Now to keep moving without repeating, let's shift to a different evidence type that ties directly to lingering hazard. Symptoms. Because some Mesopotamian medical texts and incantation texts describe sets of symptoms associated with certain forces, often framed as winds or radiance. And the symptom clusters are oddly specific. Nausea and vomiting, bleeding, skin lesions, weakness, collapse, hair loss in some descriptions, long recovery in survivors. Now, ancient medicine uses different conceptual models than modern medicine, so you have to be careful. Ancient scribes did not diagnose radiation sickness. They did not know about ionizing particles, but they did observe symptom patterns, and symptom patterns can be recorded with surprising accuracy even without knowing cause. If a group of people opens a sealed chamber and several die within days, while others suffer for months, you can record that. You can decide the chamber is dangerous. You can create new protocols. You can embed those protocols in ritual. This brings us to a key pivot. Instead of asking, what were the weapons, ask, how did the society manage risk? because risk management is visible in texts and architecture even if the underlying technology is not. And Mesopotamian cultures appear to have had categories of risk that map onto how they treat divine weapons: isolation, sealing, controlled access, special personnel requirements, limited exposure, periodic inspection, purification procedures that may function like decontamination, timed ceremonies that may function like scheduled maintenance. Even if you interpret all this as religious behavior, it still represents a functional system for managing powerful things. Now, once you see this, you can understand why kings cared about temple arsenals. Because a king's legitimacy was tied to his relationship with the gods, yes, but also because the gods' assets were stored in the temples. And if those assets were real objects, even ceremonial ones controlling them is political power. It gives you authority, it gives you prestige, it gives you leverage. And if those assets were dangerous, controlling them is also safety. Now there's another angle that tends to slip past people. When ancient kings claim they carry a god's weapon, they often use formulaic language. Scholars are right about that. But formulaic language doesn't automatically mean not real. Modern militaries use formulaic language too. A commander can say we have air superiority, and it can be both rhetoric and a literal operational condition. A king can say, I am equipped with the weapon of the storm god, and it can mean divine favour, and it can also reference an actual ceremonial object, and it can also hint at a tradition of inherited assets stored in a temple. In other words, political language can carry multiple layers at once. So the correct question becomes, when the texts talk about divine weapons, are they always doing the same thing? Or do different genres use the weapon language differently? It's possible that epic poetry dramatizes. Ritual texts preserve protocol. Inventories preserve location. Royal inscriptions use the language as rhetoric. Medical texts preserve observed effects. If that's true, then the weapon tradition is not a single phenomenon. It is a network of references across society. And networks are how real institutional knowledge survives. Now, to keep this investigation fresh, we need a scenario where multiple strands converge at once. Weapon effect, tactical procedure, and an object that functions like a control key. That brings you back to the Tablet of Destinies, but not as a symbol, as a system artifact. A thing whose removal causes system failure. A thing whose possession allows you to deactivate weapons and alter outcomes. A thing that is heavy shines, requires touch, and is returned to restore normal operations. When you read that as mythology, it's about legitimacy. When you read it as system language, it's about command authority. So here is the new development. Instead of focusing on weapons alone, focus on control. Because in complex systems, control is the real power. A weapon that acts on its own is dangerous unless it is governed by authorization. A coordinated swarm is useless unless it has a control architecture. A storage chamber is meaningless unless access is regulated. A containment protocol is pointless unless a governing authority enforces it. So the next part of the journey is not another weapon list. It's an examination of control mechanisms. How do the texts describe authorization? How do they describe who can command? How do they describe what happens when command is compromised? And how do they describe system restoration? Because if the whole divine warfare tradition has a backbone, it is not the drama. It's the repeated insistence that power is procedural. Decisions are made in council. Commands activate systems. Keys confer authority. Seals matter. Words matter because words function like permissions. And when permissions are stolen, even gods become paralyzed. That is the most technical idea in the entire corpus. Not the beams of light, not the flying weapons, but the concept that a complex world runs on authorization and that without it, nothing moves. Let's go deeper into that. If you strip away the drama and the divine names, one theme keeps standing up again and again. Authority is not just status. Authority is a function, a mechanism, a permission system, and the texts treat it like something that can be held, transferred, stolen, revoked, restored. That is a very specific way to imagine power. Most mythologies treat power like an aura. A god is powerful because they are powerful. A king is powerful because fate says so. But in a surprising number of Mesopotamian narratives, power behaves like infrastructure. If the infrastructure is intact, the world runs. If the infrastructure is compromised, everything locks up. That is why the Tablet of Destinies is so strange. Not because it's a mystical object, but because it behaves like a control key. When it is present, systems function. When it is removed, systems freeze. And when it is recovered, systems reboot. Now there's an important detail that can get overlooked in the Anzu story. The crisis is not simply that Anzu becomes stronger. The crisis is that everyone else becomes weaker. The gods become stalled, immobile, unable to act. Brilliance is extinguished. Offices cease. It reads like a distributed network losing its central authorization token. And you see the same logic in smaller ways in other texts. Weapons are not always used by simply swinging them. Weapons are awakened. Weapons are given their me. Weapons receive a command. Weapons can be put to rest. Weapons can be turned back. Those verbs describe states. Dormant, active, inhibited, redirected. That is state machine thinking, and it shows up in stories that are supposed to be myth. So here's a new way to approach the subject that avoids the stale argument of literal or metaphor. Instead of asking whether the weapons were real, ask whether the system logic is real. Because even if the weapons are imagined, the system logic reflects how Mesopotamians understood governance, temple authority, and the management of dangerous things. In that worldview, control is sacred. Now look at how the Anzu narrative solves the problem. The first plan fails because the enemy can issue commands. The text even emphasizes speech. Anzu must not be allowed to speak his decrees. That is fascinating because it frames command transmission as vocal. But vocal command is just a cultural metaphor for authorization. A Bronze Age writer does not have a concept of encrypted signals, but they do have a concept of spoken orders that must be obeyed. So when the text says attack before he can speak, it may mean deny him the chance to transmit authorization. Then the solution becomes communication disruption. Noise, wind, roar. The storm covers the approach. Anzu cannot issue decrees. The attacker closes quickly, physically seizes the control artifact. And the moment the artifact returns, the world begins moving again. This is not the logic of a magic duel. This is the logic of a raid on a command center. And here is the deeper implication. If these texts preserve anything like operational memory, they preserve tactics for what to do when command is compromised. Do not rely on autonomous systems. Close distance. Use direct action. Disrupt communication. Seize the key. Restore authority through physical control. Even modern doctrine contains versions of that logic. If your drone link is compromised, you cut the link. If your network is compromised, you isolate segments. If your authorization is stolen, you revoke and reissue keys. If your opponent controls your automated defenses, you go manual. The Anzu story is a Bronze Age poetic version of that. Now, to keep pushing into new territory, let's talk about the concept of me. Because if there is a word that functions like a system vocabulary term, it is that one. In religious translation, me becomes divine decrees or powers or cosmic principles. But the way it behaves around weapons is different. Me can be assigned. Me can be taken. Me can be lost. Me can be restored. Weapons have me. Weapons operate by me. Weapons cease when me is removed. If you wanted to describe programming without knowing the concept, you might describe it like that. A set of operating principles a thing must possess in order to perform its function. And then you notice something else. Not every god has every me. Some gods are described as specialists. Some gods are described as needing others to build or authorize or operate certain systems. Wisdom gods provide instructions. Storm gods provide winds. War gods deploy strike systems. Sky gods provide the net. Authority gods hold the tablet. This division of labour is not typical of purely symbolic pantheons. It reflects institutional specialisation. It reflects distributed control across roles, which again points you toward bureaucracy. Now there is a very quiet but powerful detail in temple inventory language. Some entries do not just say weapon of X stored in chamber. They include restrictions like none may touch, or only the king, or only the high priest, or never open simultaneously. Those are access controls. And access controls exist for two reasons: value and risk. If something is valuable, you restrict access. If something is dangerous, you restrict access. If something is both, you restrict access even more. So when you read kept behind 3 doors, you are reading the ancient version of layered security, which leads to an uncomfortable but useful thought. Even if the divine weapons were later symbolic objects, the control architecture around them could preserve earlier realities. An institution can turn an operational system into a ritual system while keeping the controls intact. That happens when the system is no longer used for its original purpose, but still considered too dangerous or too sacred to treat casually. Now here is a new development that changes the emotional tone. The texts occasionally hint that weapon systems have fail-safes. The Tablet of Destinies can deactivate weapons. Commands can cause weapons to return. A net can trap. Winds can jam terrors. Even in the myth framework, there is an insistence that systems can be inhibited. That suggests a world where weapons are not unstoppable cosmic forces. They are tools with controls. Now pause and consider what kind of culture writes about gods fighting wars. It is a culture that has experienced war as a constant. Mesopotamia was not a peaceful place. City-states fought. Borders shifted, kings rose and fell, siege was a reality, hunger was a reality, disease was a reality. So the idea of weapon systems and the idea that control of those systems determines outcomes would resonate deeply even if you never saw any advanced technology. That's why these stories survive. They are meaningful. But the question remains, why do they keep using procedural descriptions that sound like system operation? One answer is scribal habit. Scribal education trained people to write in formulaic procedural patterns. Another answer is that these stories absorbed administrative language from temple and palace life. When you live in a world of inventories, regulations and protocols, your myths will inherit that shape. And that is important because it shows how mythology can become technical without being literal technology. But then you hit the hard edge again. The physical architecture, sealed chambers, ventilation, metal linings, controlled access. And when architecture aligns with the control logic in texts, you get a convergence, not proof. Convergence. Now we need to keep evolving the investigation so it doesn't become a loop. So let's zoom out from Mesopotamia itself and look at the wider phenomenon. If Mesopotamian texts are truly describing advanced weapon systems, you would expect echoes in other traditions. Not identical, but similar patterns. And if Mesopotamian texts are simply myth using technical language, you would still expect similar myth patterns elsewhere, because humans personify disaster and warfare everywhere. So either way, cross-cultural echoes matter. But we have to handle that carefully, because it's easy to cherry-pick similarities and build fantasy bridges. So here is a more disciplined approach. Instead of comparing names and monsters, compare functions. Do other ancient traditions describe weapons that act autonomously? Do they describe radiance that paralyzes? Do they describe winds that enter and kill? Do they describe a control artifact that confers authority over systems? Do they describe sealed, dangerous objects requiring strict handling? Those are functional motifs. And functional motifs are harder to dismiss as coincidence when they appear repeatedly across disconnected cultures, but they can still arise from common human experiences: storms, disease, fire, political authority, taboo. So again, it's not proof, it's pattern. Now, rather than making a global tour that feels like filler, let's pick one functional motif and follow it into a new space. The dangerous object that must be sealed, because this motif can show up in myths as the cursed box, the forbidden jar, the locked chest, the sealed chamber, the object that cannot be opened without disaster. It's a human archetype, but in Mesopotamia, it also appears in administrative language. The lock is literal, the bolt is literal, the chamber is literal, the attendants are real, the inspection schedule is real. So even if the story around it is myth, the institution around it is not. That brings us to a new angle. Instead of treating these texts as either history or myth, treat them as cultural interfaces around risk. An interface is what humans build between themselves and something they fear or cannot fully control. A reactor has interfaces. A disease has interfaces. A weapon has interfaces. An institution creates protocols. A community creates taboos. A priesthood creates rituals. A scribe creates instructions. And the interface persists even when the original reality fades, because the interface is what keeps people safe. Now, if you accept that you can reinterpret the divine weapon tradition as a gigantic interface around something that once felt overwhelmingly dangerous, whether natural catastrophe, war, trauma, or something else, that would explain why the texts are precise about handling. It would explain why the texts obsess over containment. It would explain why the stories include regret and policy changes. It would explain why later generations keep copying them even when they cannot fully understand. Because the interface is more important than the explanation. If you want to survive, you follow the rules. You do not open the chamber. You do not disturb the sleeping seven. You do not approach the radiance without protection. You do not break the seal. You do not let the wrong being hold the tablet. These are survival commands encoded as myth. Now here is the final new move before the closing stretch of the script. We have explored weapons, effects, containment and control. But there is one more domain that ties them all together. The human role. Because the texts are not just about gods. They are about how humans live under systems they do not control. Humans build cities. Humans become noisy. Humans get punished. Humans pray for protection from specific named forces. Humans maintain temples that house dangerous objects. Humans carry out rituals that keep weapons asleep. Humans become collateral damage when systems are activated. In other words, humans are not the operators. Humans are the managed population, and that creates a certain tone in these texts, all mixed with fear, reverence, mixed with practical anxiety. So the next part shifts focus from what were the weapons to what did this worldview do to human society, how it shaped kingship, how it shaped temples, how it shaped daily life, how it shaped a culture that believed dangerous systems existed above them and around them, and that survival depended on obedience to protocols. That is where the story becomes less about ancient mystery and more about ancient psychology. And that is where it starts to feel uncomfortably familiar. Picture what it feels like to live in a world where the most powerful forces are not just storms and disease, but named systems with known behaviours. Not random, not unknowable, known enough that you can list them, known enough that you can petition against them, known enough that you can build an entire institution around keeping them calm. That is what these texts imply about daily life. Even if you interpret the weapons as metaphor, the emotional reality remains. People believed there were forces that could be triggered, forces that had patterns, forces that had protocols. And once a society believes that, it changes everything. It changes how kings rule. It changes how temples operate. It changes what ordinary people fear at night. Because in that world, you do not only fear a flood, you fear the possibility that a council somewhere divine or political will authorize the flood. You do not only fear war, you fear the possibility that a named weapon will be awakened and sent. You do not only fear disease, you fear that a wind, a radiance, a plague could be released as a deliberate act. So the first human impact is psychological. A culture of procedural anxiety, not just superstition, procedural anxiety. People believe safety depends on doing the steps correctly. The steps matter. The words matter. The calendar matters. Who touches the object matters. Who enters the chamber matters. The right ritual at the right time is not decoration, it is maintenance. This kind of thinking produces a very specific kind of society, one that is obsessed with correctness. And Mesopotamian societies were. They recorded everything. They tracked offerings. They tracked inventories. They tracked omens. They tracked eclipses. They tracked the movement of stars. They tracked the price of barley. They tracked the number of sheep. They tracked the exact sequence of ritual steps. Even if you ignore the mysterious angle, you can see a culture that believed the world is stable only when procedures are followed. Now that procedural worldview is the perfect environment for long-term knowledge transmission, because procedures survive even when explanations fade. A family can forget why they do something, but they keep doing it because someone once learned the cost of not doing it. A temple can forget why a chamber is lined with metal, but it keeps the chamber sealed because the tradition says opening it is dangerous. A priesthood can forget the original meaning of a weapon name, but it keeps reciting the name because the name is part of the protocol. So when you see the weapon tradition persist for centuries, you can interpret it not as technological inheritance, but as procedural inheritance. The society inherited rules, and the rules outlived understanding. Now think about kingship under those conditions. A king is not just a war leader. A king becomes a mediator between people and dangerous forces. The king is the one who participates in festivals that renew promises. The king is the one who has the authority to open sealed things, or at least to supervise those who do. The king is the one who can claim the weapons of a god as political legitimacy. Even if the weapons are symbolic, controlling the symbols is controlling the story, and controlling the story is controlling the city. That is why temples and palaces are intertwined in Mesopotamia. The economy, the religion, and the state are one machine. So divine weapons serve a political function. They justify order. They justify obedience. They justify hierarchy. Because if people believe disaster can be triggered by improper behaviour, they accept control more easily. Now that sounds cynical, but it does not have to be cynical. It can be sincere. Leaders may truly believe they are protecting their city by doing rituals correctly. And when survival has always been fragile, belief becomes practical. So the second human impact is institutional. A temple is not only a place of worship, it is an archive. It is a warehouse. It is an armory. It is a risk management centre. It stores grain. It stores texts. It stores sacred objects. It stores weapons. And if the texts are right, it also stores things that require containment. So you start seeing why priests had power. They were the technicians of the sacred system. They knew the schedule. They knew the language. They knew the steps. They knew the purification rules. They knew what not to touch. That is expertise. And expertise becomes authority. Now consider how this plays out for ordinary people. If you are a farmer, your life depends on canals, rain, and the right flood level. You already live with anxiety. But then you hear stories that floods can be authorized, that plagues can be sent, that winds can be released, that radiance can be deployed. You cannot control those things. So you do the one thing you can. You participate. You bring offerings. You follow taboos. You obey. You let the specialist handle the dangerous objects. This is why prayers asking protection from specific named weapons make sense. They function like people today asking protection from specific diseases. You do not pray vaguely, you pray precisely, because the threat is precise. Now there is a darker dimension. When a culture believes disaster is tied to authorization, it can interpret suffering as intentional. Flood happens, it was decided. Disease spreads, it was sent. A city falls. The enemy had the gods or the weapons. This creates a worldview where injustice feels cosmic. It feels built into the system. And that leads to a very particular emotional tone in Mesopotamian literature, resignation mixed with negotiation. People do not expect fairness. They expect procedure. They hope to bargain. They hope to be spared. They hope someone with authority will intervene. Now here is the new development that brings this into sharper focus. In many Mesopotamian stories, the hero does not win by being morally superior. The hero wins by getting access to the right intervention. A god warns him. A god lends a wind. A god provides a countermeasure. A god shares instructions. That is a world where survival depends on insider knowledge. And insider knowledge becomes the most valuable currency. That is why scribal culture becomes so important. If you can read, you can access the protocol. If you can copy texts, you can preserve it. If you can interpret omens, you can predict events. So scribes are not just writers, they are operators of meaning. They become a class. And you can feel that in colophons, where scribes beg future readers to understand and preserve knowledge. That's not just pride, that is fear. Fear that the chain will break. Because if the chain breaks, the procedures are lost. If the procedures are lost, safety is lost. Now there's another effect that emerges when you treat disasters as deployable. You become obsessed with preventing activation. You create rituals that bind. You create incantations that block. You create city-wide practices that form barriers. You treat certain places as sleeping zones. You mark boundaries. You declare certain stones forbidden. You avoid specific ruins. You treat the past as an active hazard. That is a major shift. In many cultures, ruins are sacred or nostalgic. Here, ruins can be dangerous. Not haunted in the entertainment sense, but hazardous in the practical sense. And this produces something that can be detected: archaeologically deliberate avoidance. Sites that remain empty, zones that are not resettled even though they are strategically useful. Temples built around sealed spaces, not over them. Structures that seem designed to keep people away from a centre. If you ever wondered why a culture would leave a valuable site untouched, taboo is an answer, but taboo can be a mask for danger. Now this brings us to the point where the script has to confront its own honesty, because it's easy to slide from taboo might preserve safety to taboo proves advanced weapons. It does not. It suggests that the culture believed something was dangerous. The danger could be symbolic contagious disease, memory, toxic materials, natural disaster zones, or something else. But the important point is that the society built systems around avoidance. Systems are real even if the underlying explanation shifts. Now, one final human impact memory. A society that experiences catastrophic destruction does not always remember it as an accident. It remembers it as a decision, because a decision gives meaning. A decision gives someone to blame. A decision gives a framework for preventing repetition. That is why councils appear in these myths. They create accountability in narrative form. The flood happens because a council decided. The weapons strike because someone authorized. The system fails because the tablet was stolen. These are explanations that help humans cope, because if disaster is purely random, you are helpless. But if disaster is tied to procedure, you can at least try to follow the procedure. This is the deepest reason these stories survive. They make the universe feel navigable. Now at this point, a listener might be thinking, okay, so what is the takeaway? Is this all mythology? Is it all coded technology? Is it both? A responsible script does not claim certainty, but it can do something else. It can give you a framework to hold ambiguity without losing interest. And the framework is this. These texts function like memory containers. They preserve trauma. They preserve protocol. They preserve identity. They preserve power. They preserve warnings. Whether the weapons were literal devices or symbolic storms, the function of the stories is the same. They teach people how to live under forces bigger than themselves. Now for the final stretch, there needs to be a synthesis that feels satisfying without sounding like a lecture, something that ties the archive image to the human experience. The clay tablet in a climate-controlled vault is not just an artifact. It is a preserved voice from a society that believed knowledge could keep you alive. So the closing needs to return to that. Not to prove a theory, but to frame the mystery as an invitation to read carefully, to notice how language behaves, to notice how institutions behave, to notice how humans build rituals around risk, to recognize that myth and procedure can coexist in the same lines of text, and to leave you with a question that is not a cheap cliffhanger but an honest one. If these scribes cared so much about preserving these details, what did they think future readers would do with them? That is where the ending belongs. Now let's do something different. Instead of staring at the gods and their arsenals, imagine the scribes. Not the characters in the stories, the actual people. A man with ink-stained fingertips. A woman trained in temple writing schools, memorizing sign lists until her eyes ache. A young apprentice copying lines he barely understands because his teacher says accuracy matters more than comprehension. And then imagine the moment a scribe receives a damaged tablet. Cracked, incomplete, edges missing. A fragment of an older fragment. And still he copies it. He copies it because the tradition says this material has weight. It has danger. It has authority. And the first thing he does is not interpret. He stabilizes. He preserves. He transmits. That is a very specific mindset. It is closer to archiving than storytelling, which raises a new question. What did scribes think they were doing when they preserved weapon descriptions with such care? Because even if the content is myth, the behavior around the content is technical, and that behavior matters. When people treat information like it has consequences, they create a culture that protects the information. They build archives. They build libraries. They build access rules. They create authorized readers. That is exactly what Mesopotamian scribal culture did. And it suggests that what was being preserved was not just entertainment. It was instruction, or warning, or both. Now here is a new development that shifts the investigation into a more grounded space. Look at the format of the texts themselves. Many of the narratives that include weapons also include lists, enumerations, sequences, role definitions, and the list format is a practical format. A list is not designed to be beautiful. A list is designed to be usable. A list is what you make when you want someone else to follow the same steps. A list is what you make when you want consistent repetition. This matters because weapon descriptions often appear in list-like structures. 7 weapons, 13 winds, named functions, ordered deployment. The writing style moves from poetic to procedural without apology. It is as if the narrative is the wrapper and the list is the payload. And that is a classic pattern in human knowledge transmission. You embed technical content inside stories because stories survive better than manuals. People remember stories. Stories get recited. Stories get copied. Stories become sacred. And when something becomes sacred, it gains protection. It gains longevity. So, if you wanted a set of dangerous procedures to survive for centuries, you would do well to embed it inside a sacred narrative. Even without any conspiracy, that is just good cultural engineering. Now, with that in mind, here is a different way to interpret the technical language. Not as proof of advanced technology, but as proof of an information strategy. The strategy is preserve the operational pattern, even if the explanation fades. This is exactly what rituals do. A ritual is a procedure with a story attached. You might not understand the chemistry of smoke, but you burn incense because it purifies. You might not understand microbes, but you wash because it cleanses. You might not understand radiation, but you avoid certain stones because they are cursed. You keep the behavior. The story makes it meaningful. The behavior keeps you safe. That means the weapon rituals and weapon narratives might preserve real safety behaviors. Whether the original hazard was technological or natural or biological, the system is the same. Now we need to keep adding fresh terrain, so here is the next step. If a society embeds safety behavior in sacred form, that society also creates penalties for breaking the behavior. And you see that in the stories. The ones who cross boundaries get punished. The ones who open forbidden things suffer. The ones who steal control artifacts trigger catastrophe. The stories train people to respect containment. They train people to respect authorization, and this has a social function. It reduces risky behavior. It prevents curious individuals from poking at dangerous objects. It keeps the sealed chambers sealed. It keeps the sleeping things asleep. So the myths are not only cosmology, they are compliance systems. Again, that does not require advanced weapons to be true. It requires only that the culture believed something needed to be contained. Now there is another new angle. If the temple is a risk management center, then the temple is also a place where knowledge is centralized. Knowledge is power, but centralized knowledge also means centralized vulnerability. That is why the Tablet of Destiny's theft narrative is so resonant. It dramatizes the danger of losing control of the central key. If the key is stolen, everything breaks. So the story teaches a lesson that any institution will recognize, protect the core authorization system. And because it is a myth, it teaches that lesson emotionally. You feel the paralysis. You feel the panic. You feel the fear of system collapse. That emotion makes the lesson stick. Now this leads to another human fact that often gets ignored in these discussions. Scribes were not free thinkers writing whatever they liked. They were part of institutions. They were trained to copy. They were trained to preserve. They were trained to avoid corruption of texts. So the high consistency of weapon descriptions might reflect the discipline of scribal education rather than literal technological observation. That is important and it deserves respect. But it still leaves a tension. Why preserve those specific details? Why keep the sequences? Why keep the storage rules? Why keep the warnings? If it was only metaphor, scribes could have used different metaphors. They could have simplified. They could have varied. But they did not. They repeated. They standardized. They kept the same names. They kept the same numbers. Numbers are especially stubborn. 7, 13, 50, 4, 3 doors, 7 layers of linen. Numbers are not always symbolic. Sometimes numbers are instructions. And the repeated numbers in these texts might be one of the most important clues. Not because 7 is mystical, but because standardization is useful. Standardization is how you reduce mistakes. Now, to keep the listener engaged here is a concrete thought experiment. Imagine you are a priest responsible for a sealed chamber. Your predecessor taught you the rules. Do not open the chamber casually. Do not expose the contents to sunlight. Bring purified attendants. Recite the correct words. Wrap in linen. Store in darkness. Return it to rest. Now imagine you do not understand why, but you understand that if you get it wrong, someone could die. Would you treat those rules like theatre? Or would you treat them like safety protocol? You would treat them like safety protocol. And the next generation would too, even if the reason is lost. That is how long-term dangerous knowledge survives. It gets ritualized. Now let's push into the museum reality, because that is a new development that shifts the mood. Museums are quiet, climate controlled, neutral. But the objects inside them were not neutral in their original context. A temple weapon was not art, it was power. A sealed chamber was not a tourist feature, it was a boundary. A colophon was not a cute note, it was a plea. So when we look at these tablets now, it's easy to forget the pressure behind the writing. The writer might have believed this material could affect lives, not metaphorically, practically, and that belief would shape how carefully they wrote. Now here is another fresh angle that helps avoid repetition. Think about how modern institutions handle dangerous legacy systems. Nuclear plants keep procedures written decades ago. Military organizations keep manuals for systems that few people fully understand. Hospitals keep protocols that are followed even when the rationale is not fully explained to every nurse. Airplanes have checklists. A pilot does not improvise. Aviation safety is built on doing the same steps every time. And aviation safety is full of things that look ritualistic from the outside: call and response checklist, reading, formal phrasing, confirmation. But it is not theatre, it is discipline. If Mesopotamian temples handled dangerous things, their rituals might be the ancient equivalent of checklists. Not primitive superstition, but structured human behaviour designed to prevent catastrophe. So the question becomes less sensational and more human. What kind of hazards produce rituals that behave like checklists? Now we are nearing the end, so the script needs to start turning toward closure. Closure does not mean solving the mystery. Closure means framing it in a way that feels satisfying. Here is the framing. The tablets do not only preserve stories, they preserve the shape of how a civilization thought about risk, authority, and survival. They show that ancient people were not naive. They built institutions. They wrote protocols. They preserved consistency. They feared system failure. They feared unauthorized access. They feared awakenings. They feared breaches. That worldview can be read as myth. It can also be read as institutional memory. And either way, it reveals a civilization that took procedure seriously. Now, the final part needs to land on one central idea. A clay tablet is the simplest storage device imaginable, but it carries a frightening concept. Information outlives people. Warnings outlive kings. Protocols outlive empires. A scribe can be dust, but the wedge marks remain. And the wedge marks might still be saying the same thing they were always saying. Be careful. Follow the rules. Do not open what you cannot control. That is a timeless message. And it sets up the last piece of the script, the quiet ending in the archive. The sense that the mystery is not a gimmick, but a real question about how humans preserve danger through language. Let's end this the way these tablets end. Not with a triumphant answer, but with a kind of careful humility. Because the strangest thing here is not the gods. It's not the wars. It's not even the weapons. The strangest thing is the decision to preserve. Someone decided these details were worth carrying forward even when time would strip away context. And that tells you something about how serious this material felt to the people who handled it. Now imagine the last moments of a city that is about to fall. Not in a movie way, in a practical way. Smoke in the streets. People grabbing what they can. Temple doors being sealed. And somewhere, someone is moving tablets. Not jewellery, not food. Tablets. That happens in history. Archives get evacuated. Libraries get protected. Because when people feel the end coming, they try to save the thing that can rebuild identity, knowledge, records, instructions, the bones of the system. So when you hold a fragment of clay that survived a fire, you're holding something someone tried to protect. Maybe they failed, but the effort matters. Now here's the final new development, and it changes the mood. The stories about divine weapons are not unique in one important way. They feel like a civilization trying to negotiate with forces it cannot fully master. That is a universal human experience. Every generation thinks it's living at the edge of something. The edge of disease, the edge of war, the edge of climate, the edge of technology. And when we feel powerless, we do what Mesopotamia did. We build systems, we build authority, we build protocols, we build institutions that promise control. Some of those systems are rational, some are symbolic. Often they blend, and that blend is not weakness, it's how humans cope. A ritual can be both a prayer and a safety behaviour. A story can be both entertainment and instruction. A myth can be both theology and memory. So the real question is not, are the weapons real? The real question is, what kind of world produces stories that read like protocols? What kind of fear produces procedures? What kind of institutional structure preserves operational language across centuries? Because even if you decide every weapon is symbolic, you still have to explain why the symbols behave like machinery, why they have activation sequences, why they have storage rules, why they have authorized handlers, why they have failures, why they have containment. Those are not the default shapes of metaphor. That is the shape of systems. And systems are always built around something. Sometimes the something is a machine. Sometimes it's a river. Sometimes it's disease. Sometimes it's political violence. But it is always something real. Now, if you want a balanced landing, here is the most honest synthesis. These tablets are like fossils. A fossil is not the creature itself. It's the imprint left behind. It tells you the creature existed, but it doesn't tell you everything about its skin, its colour, its behaviour. You infer, you argue, you revise, you stay cautious. The weapon texts are fossils of a worldview. They preserve the imprint of how people thought danger worked. They preserve the imprint of how authority was organised. They preserve the imprint of how knowledge was treated. They preserve the imprint of how fear became procedure. So the question becomes, what is the creature behind the fossil? Was it literal technology that people ritualized? Was it natural catastrophe that people systematized? Was it political trauma that people encoded? Was it all of the above? Because a society can experience floods and wars and disease and still build the same kind of procedural myth. And a society can also encounter dangerous materials or strange phenomena and wrap them in the same kind of language. Both paths lead to similar texts. That's why certainty is hard. But difficulty does not mean the question is pointless. It means the question is deeper than a simple answer. Now the final moments of this script should return to the clay itself, because that's where all this started. A small fragment, catalogue number, cold drawer, quiet room, no drama, and yet in that quiet you can feel the weight of time. Someone pressed those wedge marks into wet clay with intention. Someone made choices. They chose which word to use. They chose which number to preserve. They chose to keep the name of a weapon consistent. They chose to write in a tone that feels oddly procedural. And then someone else copied it. And then someone else. And then someone else. Until the meaning became partly opaque, but the text survived. That chain alone is extraordinary. Now there's one more thought that belongs at the very end, because it lands like a whisper instead of a shout. If these were only stories, they were still treated like instructions. If these were only metaphors, they were still handled like hazards. If these were only symbols, they were still stored behind doors. And if the people closest to the text behaved as if something needed to be contained, that behaviour is evidence of belief at minimum and possibly experience. So maybe the most responsible way to leave this is with a question that does not demand a single answer. What if the dividing line between myth and manual is not as clean as we want it to be? What if ancient societies use myth to preserve procedures? What if they use divine language to transmit dangerous knowledge? What if the gods in these stories are not the point, but the delivery system? A narrative wrapper strong enough to protect information across millennia. And if that's true, then the real mystery is not whether a weapon could split a mountain. The real mystery is what the scribes were trying to keep from being forgotten. Because when a scribe writes a colophon that says, "May the reader understand," that is not just a flourish. That is a hand reaching forward through time. A request, a warning, a hope. Now if you're listening, somewhere quiet and the day is fading or the lights are low, maybe sit with that for a second. A civilization vanished. Its language died. Its temples crumbled. But the clay stayed, and the clay still asks something of us. Read carefully. Do not rush. Respect the unknown. And remember that sometimes the most important things humans preserve are not answers, but instructions for how to survive, questions that never fully go away.